We use so many apps every day, right? I mean, think about it. On our phones, all the web stuff we use at work, everything.
Yeah.
It all has to connect to different services online. And, it has to do it securely.
Oh, for sure. If those connections aren't right, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, exactly. You're basically handing over your data on a silver platter.
So today we're going deep on how this all works, specifically within the Microsoft Cloud. We're talking Azure Application Registration, which is part of Microsoft Entra ID.
Uh-huh. You probably remember it as Azure Active Directory. Microsoft rebranded it not too long ago.
Yeah, that's right. It's essentially the bedrock of secure application interaction in Azure.
Right. Any app, if it wants to use resources, it has to register, basically.
Yeah.
And it's got to declare what it needs access to.
Uh-huh.
If you mess up that initial registration, well, it's like leaving your front door wide open.
It really is. And this isn't just for developers or IT folks.
No, not at all. If your organization uses anything cloud-based, even just understanding the basics of how these apps get registered and authorized can be, well, eye-opening, I think.
For sure. It can give you a much better sense of your overall security, that's for sure.
Right. So in this deep dive, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to unpack Azure App Registration. We'll highlight the potential risks, those kind of hidden security potholes that you might not even realize are there.
Right.
And then we'll lay out some strategies, some smart ways to keep your cloud environment locked down tight.
It's like we're giving you a security briefing, but tailored just for you.
Exactly. And something important to keep in mind here, there isn't just one type of Azure App Registration.
Right.
Our sources actually cover a whole bunch of different types, and each one is designed for a specific kind of application.
Exactly.
It could be something super simple like a mobile app on your phone,
Yeah.
or it could be a huge, complex enterprise system.
And there's a specific type of registration that fits each one.
That's right. Our goal today is to give you a really clear understanding of this whole world of Azure App Registration, but we want to make it actionable too.
Exactly.
We want you to come away from this knowing what the potential dangers are, what the risks are, and then feel like you can actually do something about it.
Right. We don't want you to get bogged down in all the technical jargon. We want you to walk away feeling empowered.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. What kinds of Azure App Registrations are out there? What are the ones we really need to be aware of?
Okay, so let's start with the applications that users interact with directly.
Okay.
We've got things like single-page applications, also called SPAs. Have you ever used like a really responsive website
Yeah, absolutely.
where it loads once and then it just feels super fast as you're clicking around?
Yeah, those are great.
Those are often SPAs built with frameworks like Angular, React, Vue.js, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And they typically use what's called the OAuth 2.0 implicit grant flow for authentication. It's basically like, quickly showing your ID to get access to something. It's convenient, but it does come with some inherent security risks.
So that's for like the modern, really sleek, fast web experiences that we're all kind of used to now.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
What else is there?
Then you've got your more traditional web applications.
Okay.
These are, the server-side apps that have been around for a while.
Uh-huh.
They often power those larger enterprise systems that need to securely access data and resources.
Okay.
These guys typically use the OAuth 2.0 authorization code flow,
Okay.
which is it's a more secure process.
Okay.
It's kind of like getting a specific ticket after you've verified your ID. It offers a higher level of protection.
Okay. So it's like those are the workhorses, the real enterprise level apps that need that really robust security.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. Now, what about when applications need to talk to each other,
Right.
but without a person directly involved, like behind the scenes?
Yeah, so for that, you've got web APIs.
Okay. Essentially, these are applications that offer their functionality, their data, their services to other applications.
Right.
And to make sure it's secure, they use token-based authentication. So only authorized apps can get in.
Got it.
The really cool thing about web APIs is they can define very specific permissions, what are called scopes.
Okay.
So, for instance, you could have one app that can only read data from the API,
Okay.
and another app might have permission to both read and write data.
Oh,
It's like having different security clearance levels.
like different keys for different doors, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about the apps that we all use on our phones and computers.
Right.
The ones we download and install.
Yeah. So for mobile and native applications, the apps on your phone or your desktop, They use something called public client flows.
Okay.
Some examples are the device code flow or the authorization code flow.
Okay.
The main thing here is that these apps are running on devices that, well, we can't always guarantee are super secure, so they can't really store secret keys reliably, but
Okay.
they have to rely on the user authenticating themselves.
Right, because someone could, potentially get into a mobile app's code, right?
Exactly.
And see what's in there.
Yeah, so no hiding secrets in plain sight.
Okay, so no secrets there. What about the background processes, the ones that are kind of running behind the scenes, keeping things ticking, but we don't really see them?
Right, so those fall under the category of daemon or server-side applications.
Okay.
These are things like your background services, scheduled tasks, scripts, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
They run without any direct interaction from the user.
Okay.
And because they operate on servers that we know are secure, they actually can use the client credentials flow,
Okay.
which involves using a client secret or a certificate to prove who they are.
Okay, so secrets are okay as long as they're locked away on a secure server.
Right, exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So this brings us to confidential client applications, right?
Yeah, you got it. Confidential client applications are those that can store those credentials securely, like
Yeah.
those client secrets or certificates we were talking about.
Okay.
A good example is your server-side web apps.
Okay.
They support the OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow, and they can request access tokens on behalf of a user or even on their own.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin, and then we have the opposite, the apps that can't keep secrets, right?
Exactly.
Those would be public client applications.
That's right. Public client applications are the ones we were just talking about, like those mobile and desktop apps.
Yeah.
They can't reliably store those credentials, so they're totally dependent on the user to authenticate.
Okay, so it all comes down to whether they can securely hold a secret or not.
Right.
Okay, now let's talk about how many different organizations an application can work within. Like in Azure, you have these things called tenants,
Right.
which are basically like separate instances of Azure AD.
Exactly.
So how does that work with application registration?
Well, there are multi-tenant applications. These are designed to be used by people across many different Azure AD tenants.
Okay.
Think about a cloud software service, like a CRM or something.
Okay.
Lots of different companies subscribe to it.
Right.
So for these multi-tenant apps to work in a new company's tenant, an admin from that company usually has to grant consent.
Okay.
And when that happens, what's called a service principal gets created in that tenant.
Okay.
It's like the app is setting up a little office in each new company that uses it.
So it needs permission to kind of set up shop in each organization.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the apps that are really only meant for one company?
Yeah. Those are called single tenant applications.
Okay.
They're locked down to a single Azure AD tenant,
Okay.
often used for internal tools and applications.
Right.
And their setup is way simpler because they don't need to worry about all those external Azure AD environments.
Yeah, that makes sense for those internal tools. Now, what about applications that need to work with, like regular Microsoft accounts,
Right.
like the ones we use for our personal email or for Xbox?
Yeah, there's a category for that too. Applications supporting personal Microsoft accounts.
Okay.
So these allow users to sign in using, their Outlook.com, Hotmail.com accounts, that sort of thing.
Right.
These are usually for applications that are targeted directly at consumers.
Okay.
So something like Skype or your Xbox app would probably fall into this category.
Got it. And lastly, we have Azure AD B2C applications.
Right.
What's the deal with those?
So Azure AD B2C applications are specifically designed for business-to-customer scenarios.
Okay.
Their main focus is managing the identities and access of your customers.
Okay.
And they have some really cool features, like they can support really customized user experiences and policies.
Okay.
And they can even integrate with all those social identity providers.
Oh, right, like Facebook and Google, right.
Exactly.
So your customers could sign in using their social media accounts.
Exactly, yeah. So it offers a lot of flexibility.
Wow, that's a lot of different application registration types. It's pretty amazing how flexible Azure is.
It really is, yeah.
So it sounds like getting a handle on all these different types is really the first step in making sure things are secure, right?
Absolutely. You need to know what you're working with, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the specifics of each type, how they're supposed to be used, that's how you can make smart decisions about how to configure them, what security measures you need to put in place.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of the different kinds of app registrations. Now, let's talk about where things can go wrong.
Right.
What are the risks? What are the security concerns that we need to be aware of when we're dealing with all this?
Yeah, because with all that flexibility, There's definitely potential for things to go sideways.
Right.
So while Azure App Registration gives you a really powerful way to manage secure access, if things aren't configured correctly or if you have some bad management practices, well, you're opening yourself up to some serious vulnerabilities.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the big ones?
All right, well, a big one is misconfiguration risks.
Okay.
This is where we see a lot of problems.
Okay.
For example, let's say you've got a multi-tenant application
Okay.
and the authorization settings aren't set up quite right.
Uh-huh.
You could accidentally give users from other organizations access to your stuff.
Oh, wow.
I mean, potentially really sensitive data.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
What other kind of misconfigurations should we be looking out for?
Well, another one is misusing the OAuth 2.0 implicit flow.
Okay.
It's sometimes used for SPAs because it's simpler,
Uh-huh.
but it's inherently less secure.
Okay.
And it can make your application vulnerable to token interception.
Okay.
And then there's things like wildcard redirect URIs.
Okay, remind me, what's a redirect URI again?
Right, so when you register an app, you have to tell Azure where to send users back to after they've authenticated.
Okay, got it.
So if you use wildcards in those redirect URIs, or if you use plain HTTP instead of HTTPS, you're making it easier for attackers to intercept those redirects
Oh, yeah.
and potentially steal access tokens.
So you're saying those redirect destinations have to be very, very specific and secure.
Exactly. You also want to watch out for dangling redirect URIs.
Okay.
These are redirect URIs that point to domains you no longer control.
Okay.
An attacker could take over that domain and use it to compromise your app. It's like leaving a forwarding address with someone you don't trust.
Okay, so be very careful with those redirect URIs.
Right.
Got it. Now, what about secrets and passwords that applications sometimes use?
Yeah, that brings us to credential management risks.
Okay.
Now, sometimes client secrets are necessary.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, they're less secure than using certificates.
Okay.
And if they're not protected properly, they can be compromised.
Right.
And the longer those credentials stay valid, what we call long expiry credentials,
Yeah.
the bigger the risk.
Okay.
Because if an attacker gets hold of them, they have more time to use them.
Right, right. Makes sense.
We've also seen cases of credential exposure.
Okay.
This is where developers accidentally put secrets right into the code repository
Oh, no.
or share them across different environments.
Yeah.
That's a huge no-no.
Yeah.
Secrets have to be treated like gold.
Yeah, secrets should be kept, well, secret.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about misconfigurations, credentials. What about those consent grant attacks? I feel like I've heard about those, but I don't really know what they are.
Yeah, these are really sneaky and they can be hard to spot.
Okay.
So basically, an attacker will create an application that looks totally legitimate,
Okay.
but then they'll trick users into giving it way more permissions than it needs.
Oh, okay.
And they often do this through phishing.
Right.
So once a user grants consent, the attacker's app can access all sorts of sensitive data in their account.
Oh, wow.
And they do this without even needing the user's username or password.
Oh, that's bad.
Yeah, and in some cases, they can even bypass multi-factor authentication.
So they're basically getting users to hand over the keys without even realizing it.
Exactly. It's all about exploiting trust.
That's scary.
Hmm.
Now, you mentioned earlier that multi-tenant apps come with their own unique risks.
They do, yeah.
What are some of those?
Well, for one thing, multi-tenant application risks are just generally higher because they're accessible by more people.
Right, across different organizations.
Exactly. It increases the attack surface.
Okay.
And we've seen cases of external tenant misuse.
Okay.
This is where someone with bad intentions in a connected organization uses the app registration to do something harmful.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of times, security teams don't have a ton of visibility into how external tenants are interacting with their multi-tenant apps.
Right, because it's spanning across organizational boundaries.
Exactly. So it's just harder to keep an eye on everything.
Makes sense. Now, what about phishing?
Yeah. Phishing and token interception are still a big threat.
Okay.
Attackers can create malicious app registrations that look totally real.
Right, to trick people.
Exactly. They'll use these in phishing emails to get users to enter their credentials or even to intercept those access tokens directly.
So they're leveraging that trust that people have in legitimate app registrations.
Right.
Okay. Now, what about the permissions we give to applications? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but I feel like that's a big one.
It is, yeah. Privileged permissions and role misuse are definitely a major concern.
Okay.
If an application gets way too much access, like administrator-level access,
Yeah.
that makes it a prime target for attackers.
Like, because they can do so much damage.
Exactly. And even if an application has the right permissions initially, you have to monitor them.
Okay.
Things change over time. Someone might leave the company, a role might change, and those permissions need to be adjusted accordingly.
So you're saying you can't just set it and forget it. You have to constantly review and make sure things are still appropriate.
Exactly.
Okay. What about applications that people aren't using anymore? Can those still be a risk?
Definitely. Orphaned and unmonitored applications are a huge liability.
Okay.
If an application doesn't have a clear owner or no one's paying attention to it, checking up on it,
Right.
any changes, any unauthorized changes, well, they might go completely unnoticed.
Yeah.
And that's how you end up with these back doors that attackers can exploit.
It's like leaving an old abandoned building unlocked, hoping no one finds it.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Now, we've heard about supply chain attacks in the news.
Right.
Are those a concern here with Azure App Registrations?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
So with supply chain attacks, what happens is attackers will try to gain access by adding their own credentials to legitimate applications and service principals.
Oh, okay.
This can give them long-term access to compromised tenants. And multi-tenant applications are especially vulnerable because they reach across so many different organizations.
So it's not just about protecting your own organization,
Right.
but also protecting others who might be using your applications.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, we also need to be careful about using outdated technologies, right?
Yeah, that's a big one. Legacy protocols and authentication methods can introduce some serious weaknesses.
Okay.
For example, there's this thing called ROPC, Resource Owner Password Credentials.
Okay.
It's an old method, and it's known to be vulnerable to attacks like password spraying,
Okay.
which is where attackers just try common passwords on tons of different accounts.
Oh, right.
So it's really important to move away from those older technologies and embrace more modern, secure approaches.
Okay, so modernization is key.
Yeah.
Now, what about knowing when something bad is actually happening?
Right. That brings us to insufficient monitoring and logging.
Okay.
If you're not watching for things like suspicious consent events,
Yeah.
you might completely miss an attack that's already happening.
Right.
And if you're not keeping those audit logs long enough, you might not have the data you need to investigate an incident after the fact.
Yeah, you can't fix what you can't see.
Exactly.
What about third-party applications?
Right.
The ones we integrate with our systems.
Yeah, third-party applications can definitely be a weak point.
Okay.
There was this vulnerability called OAuth a while back.
Okay.
It showed how weaknesses in third-party apps combined with certain Azure AD configurations could actually lead to account takeovers.
Oh, wow.
And apps that only use email addresses to identify users, those can be especially vulnerable.
So it sounds like we need to be really careful about which third-party apps we connect to.
Absolutely. You need to vet them carefully.
Okay. And lastly, what about letting anyone in an organization register applications? Is that a good idea?
Generally, no. User consent risks are something to be very wary of.
Okay.
By default, Azure AD often lets all users register apps and grant consent,
Mm-hmm.
but attackers can take advantage of this. So it's usually a good idea to disable those user consent operations
Okay.
and instead put in place a more controlled process where admins review and approve any new app registrations.
So basically have someone in charge of vetting those requests.
Exactly. It helps prevent unauthorized or malicious apps from slipping through the cracks.
Makes sense. Wow. That is a pretty long list of potential dangers.
It is, yeah.
It really highlights how important it is to get this Azure App Registration stuff right.
Right. Security is not something you can afford to be casual about.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some real-world examples that illustrate these risks.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Can you walk us through a few of those?
Sure. One example from the sources is what's called an illicit consent grant attack.
Okay.
Basically, attackers used a malicious app registered in Azure combined with some phishing tactics,
Right.
and they were able to gain access to a ton of sensitive data.
Oh, wow.
That's a really clear example of how much damage can be done if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming.
Another example is the supply chain attack, like we talked about before.
Okay.
They actually referenced the SolarWinds compromise, which was a huge deal.
Right, I remember that.
That showed how attackers could add unauthorized credentials to Azure apps and gain access that spanned multiple organizations.
Yeah, that was a really big wake-up call for a lot of companies.
It was, yeah. And then there's the NOAuth vulnerability.
Okay.
That one showed how weaknesses in both Azure AD and third-party apps could be exploited.
Okay.
Basically, attackers were able to take over accounts just by messing with email identifiers.
Oh, wow.
And then, of course, there are countless examples of phishing campaigns that use malicious Azure applications.
Right.
They use these apps to gather information from users and even send emails that look like they're coming from legitimate sources.
Yeah. So it looks like it's coming from someone you trust.
Exactly.
Okay, so these real-world examples really drive home the point that these aren't just hypothetical risks.
Right. This stuff is happening all the time.
This is the real deal.
It is. But the good news is there are things we can do to protect ourselves.
Okay, so let's talk about those.
Yeah.
What are some concrete steps we can take to make sure we're not leaving ourselves vulnerable?
All right, so the first big principle is least privilege.
Okay,
You want to make sure that you're only giving applications the bare minimum permissions they need to do their job.
right, nothing extra.
Exactly. So, for example, don't give an app permission to read all files if it only needs access to one specific folder.
Okay,
And it's really important to do regular access reviews.
okay.
Go through and check if the permissions are still needed.
Right, because things change.
They do, yeah. Revoke anything that's not necessary.
Okay, so it's about being very deliberate with those permissions.
Right. Now, let's talk about how we authenticate the applications themselves.
Okay,
Microsoft strongly recommends using certificates over secrets, especially in production environments.
okay.
Certificates are just more secure. Now, if you absolutely have to use client secrets, then you need to make sure they're stored securely.
Okay, and where's the best place to do that?
Azure Key Vault is a great option.
Okay,
And you need to rotate them regularly, like every 60 to 90 days at least.
okay.
And never, ever hard code secrets directly into your code.
Right, yeah, that's a big no-no.
Treat those secrets like they're the crown jewels.
Exactly. Now, how do we decide whether an application should be multi-tenant or single-tenant?
Well, think about what the app is actually for.
Okay,
If it's just for internal use, a single tenant application is usually enough.
okay.
And often it's more secure that way.
Right,
If you're building a SaaS solution, then yeah, you'll need a multi-tenant application.
right.
But those require extra security measures.
Okay, like what?
You really need to validate those token issuers, and you might want to implement things like tenant allow lists
Okay.
to restrict who can access your application.
Okay, so it's about really thinking about who needs to be able to use this app. Okay. Now, what about who's actually responsible for managing all this?
Yeah, governance and ownership are absolutely critical.
Okay.
Every app registration should have at least 2 owners.
Okay, why two?
Well, it prevents those orphaned applications we talked about.
Right.
And just make sure there's accountability.
Okay.
You should also review that ownership information regularly.
Okay.
And you need to have a clear lifecycle management policy.
Okay, so what would that include?
Well, it would include things like regular audits and a process for getting rid of applications that aren't being used anymore.
Okay, so knowing who's responsible for what.
Right, exactly.
All right. We talked earlier about redirect URIs. How can we make sure those are secure?
Okay, so for secure configuration of redirect URIs, the main thing is don't use wildcard URLs
Okay.
because attackers can exploit those.
Right.
And always use HTTPS,
Okay.
never HTTP.
Okay.
And it's important to verify that you actually own and control the domains that you're redirecting to.
Okay, so it's about being specific with those redirect destinations and making sure they're verified.
Exactly.
Okay, what about more active security measures?
Yeah, so things like conditional access and monitoring are really important.
Okay.
Conditional access lets you set up rules to enforce strong authentication.
Yep.
You can restrict access based on all sorts of things, like the user's location, the device they're using, that sort of thing.
Okay, so it's about adding those extra layers of security.
Exactly. And you want to make sure you have good monitoring in place.
Right.
Set up alerts so you know if anything suspicious is happening with your app registrations.
So we're proactively looking for trouble.
Exactly. It's much better to catch things early.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about separating our different environments,
Right.
like our development, testing, and production environments?
Yeah, environment separation is a really important best practice.
Okay.
You should use separate app registrations for each of those environments.
Okay, so dev, test, and prod all have their own separate registrations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That way, if something goes wrong in your development environment, it doesn't impact your live systems.
Right, it keeps things isolated.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, we also talked about managing consent and permissions.
Right.
What are the best practices there?
So for consent and permissions management, you want to make sure that any permissions that require admin consent, those are only granted after a very careful review.
Okay.
You need to understand exactly what the application is requesting,
Right.
and you should be regularly reviewing and revoking any consents that are no longer needed.
Okay, so don't let those unused permissions just sit there.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, are there any tools or automation capabilities that we can use to make all of this easier?
Definitely. Using automation and tools is a huge help.
Okay.
You can use Azure Key Vault to manage your secrets and certificates.
Okay.
That keeps them secure. And you can use things like Azure Monitor and Logic apps to automate workflows.
Okay, what kind of workflows?
While you can track application registration activities, you can identify applications that might be risky or unused.
Okay.
And you can even use PowerShell scripts to automate certain tasks.
Okay, like what kind of tasks?
Well, things like retrieving application details or checking when credentials are going to expire.
Okay, so automate as much as possible to reduce the chance of human error.
Exactly.
Okay, now how?